Well, it is really an honor and a real joy to be back here again with you. Again, it was 2 years ago now that I last preached here, and that was really fun. And I'm always hearing really wonderful things about all of you, your generosity, your kindness, your grace from my parents, Steve and Linda Boyle. And so it's really wonderful to be able to be here with you and worship together today. As Taylor said, I teach at George Fox University, and George Fox is a Quaker school. If you don't know about the Quakers, they are a Protestant denomination that developed in England in the late 1600s. And they have some different quirky practices, but one of the things I've really loved about being at a Quaker institution is the way that they pray. They have a few quirks when they pray. One of them is they will pray with their eyes open sometimes, and people will shout out from around the room things that are on their heart. And then they'll say, Lord, hear our prayer, after somebody shouts something out. And I love that idea of praying with your eyes open, like so that you can see what's going on around you and what needs prayer. I've learned that from the Quakers. Another thing I've learned from the Quakers, though, is the value of silence. And as someone who likes to talk a lot, learning the value of silence has been good. I'm sure my parents wish I would have learned it a bit earlier. Along those lines, though, I would like to invite you, as we open in prayer this morning, before we open Scripture together, to maybe just put your feet flat on the floor. Close your eyes. Take a couple of deep breaths. And everything that you've brought into this room this morning, your hopes and your fears, the things you need to do after church, your concerns for the week, just think of those right now and offer them up to God, and then set them aside, knowing that they're in His hands. And let's sit in silence together for a moment and ask the Spirit to come. O Lord, open my lips, and my mouth shall declare your praise. Amen. All right. As Taylor preached last week, sometimes the ending of different stories in the New Testament can be a bit disappointing. In the Gospel of Mark, the original manuscripts don't even have a resurrection. At the end of Acts, Paul's like chilling in Rome in prison, and things are not really great. And then we get a bunch of his letters that tell us that the church was a hot mess. And that's it. That's kind of where the story ends in many, many ways. Except, as Taylor very rightly pointed out, we are living in Act 5. Because we do get the final scene of the final act, and it's a good one. But it's like the missing middle of Act 5 that we are living in ourselves. And this is an analogy that the scholar N.T. Wright uses to talk about the Christian life. He says the Christian life and the Bible are like a 5-act Shakespeare play. We have the first 4 acts, and maybe even the first scene of the 5th act. But scenes 2 through, 6 or 7 are missing. And then we have scene 8 where we see the conclusion. And we are trying to live faithfully and play our roles faithfully in those missing scenes. And as with any work of literature, we know who some of the major characters are and some of the major themes and the narrative energy and where that's going, but we don't know exactly what's supposed to happen in these missing scenes. Exactly how does the plot work out to get us to scene 8? And so this is what we talked about a lot at Daughters of Unity yesterday, because of course, how can we live faithfully in scenes 2 through 7 if we don't know what's come in Acts 1 through 4? If we don't know Acts 1 for 4, we're going to be very, very lost. So we just took on a little bit yesterday. We did the entire Bible in 3 45-minute sessions. So if people are like, wow, it was great, but it was just a lot, yeah, it was. It was, the whole Bible. Because we cannot live faithfully in Act 5 if we don't know Acts 1 through 4 well. And we looked at some of the things that are reoccurring in those acts to help us sort of find the rhythms and the characterizations that mark the people of God, so that we might be able to live faithfully in this final act of the play. And one of the things that we didn't talk about yesterday, but that is really important to the first 4 acts, is food. Yeah. In fact, I am starting to think that food might be the key to the entire Bible. I know you thought it was Jesus. It's food. I teach at a college, and we frequently talk about all sorts of things in college life, and I think nothing is more stressful for first-year college students than walking in to the school dining hall. Because you walk into that space, and there are already 400 or 500 students sitting in there, and you've got your food, and you start looking for those friends. And I've done survey after survey with my classes, and here's the question I pose to them. If you walk into the dining hall, and you're not with your friends when you go in, you're by yourself, would you rather go sit by yourself and eat, or join a table of people you don't know, or take your food to go, assuming you don't find any friends? Given the way you're already chuckling, you will guess that by and large, the 2 big favorites are take my food and go, or sit at a table by myself where I will very quickly pull out a book or my phone and make it look like I'm meant to be here alone because I'm studying, thank you very much. The problem is not that I don't have friends. There are a few brave souls, my father might be one of them, who would go and sit with complete strangers. If you don't know my dad, some people are laughing because they know my dad. But it is only the very few people who have the sort of self-confidence in the world to go and do that. I am not one of those people. I am definitely taking my food to go or sitting there with my book. Yes, this is the way it was meant to be. I wanted alone time, thank you. When I start asking my students, what is it that causes this anxiety around eating, it's really fascinating to hear what they start to say. Because it turns out food is when we as people are really at our most vulnerable. What you get in that lunch line, what you pull out of your backpack to eat, that says a whole lot about you as a person. Some of my students tell stories about in elementary school how awkward it felt when they would pull out their lovingly prepared meal from their parents, and it didn't match what the other kids were eating because their family was from someplace else. My daughter used to go just crazy with kids at school. Like, is that a chocolate sandwich you're eating? Oh my gosh, how do your parents give you a chocolate sandwich? It's like, no, it's Vegemite. Ew, who would want to eat Vegemite? That's disgusting. It is not disgusting. We'll have a lesson in Vegemite one of these days. Other students would tell stories about how they would be teased because of the way their food smelled or looked. Other students would talk about the embarrassment they would feel because they didn't have a meal. They had to get the hot lunch, and everybody knew it was because their family didn't have the resources to cook for them. Other students tell stories about how food continues to be an anxiety point in their family because they don't have enough to eat, and they worry about their brothers and sisters who are missing meals. Other students tell stories about the abundance of food and how it has become such a control issue in their life. So many of my students wrestle with all of the demons that go with disordered eating. It's really hard. They're trying to be something they need to be. Other students talk about the pressure to bulk up for a sports team, the pressure to stay fit for the sports teams. And then there's all the bodily stuff that just goes on. Once you finally wrestle with all the things you have put on your tray or not put on your tray to mark yourself appropriately as part of this group or that group, or I'm trying to detox, please, or I'm trying to lose weight, please, or I'm trying to bulk up for the football team, please, or I promise you I'm fitting into this culture that doesn't feel like mine. Once you've made those selections, then you get to sit down at the table. And you sit down at the table and you suddenly become incredibly aware of your body. One of my least favorite things in the world are professional meals, because all of these things about food start to become points of like judgment. You know, if you order the soup, suddenly you realize soup is messy, and my nickname as a kid was Messy Jessie, so it is guaranteed that if I'm eating soup in front of my boss, it is going to somehow dribble down my shirt. But then you don't want to order anything that you eat with your hands, because then you're like putting food in your mouth with your face, that gets gross. You don't want to order anything too crunchy, because then as you do manage to get bites of food in during the conversation, you start hearing all this noise. You're like, oh gosh, I really shouldn't have gotten to the salad with croutons. And don't get me started on salad. Never fails, right? The big green thing stuck right there. Food makes us incredibly vulnerable because of the ways it declares our stories to everyone around us, whether we want it to or not. It draws attention to the fact that we have real bodies, whether we like them or not. And it can be incredibly awkward and painful. And yet, food, this thing we need to survive, this thing that can be so weird and strange and painful, is also a source of great joy in our lives. Christmas dinners, Thanksgiving dinners, pizza nights with friends and movies, popcorn, the joys of a great barbecue, and all that goes with it, right? Because it's not just about the food, although the food is great. But it's the people and the conversation and the sense of holy space that we get when we finally get to sit down together around a table, and we just hope Uncle John doesn't bring up something really awkward politically that's going to derail the whole event. But finally we're there. We're with our friends and we're eating, and it is good. And I think that this very real, tangible nature of food is maybe why it plays such a big role in the Bible, because it is so central to who we are and how we form community. And when you start thinking about it, it is everywhere in the Bible. In the garden, the tree. Eat of all the trees in the garden you may freely eat, but of the tree of knowledge of good and evil do not eat. For in the day that you eat thereof you shall surely die. And of course, humans eat it because, that's just who we are. There's Abraham, who gets to host these three guys who show up with a message. He's going to have a baby. Actually, Sarah's going to have the baby. It seems they're really there for Sarah, because Abraham's already heard from God. He's going to have a baby. But Sarah doesn't know this yet. And these three visitors show up. These divine visitors even show up. And he cooks a huge meal for them. We see it at the Passover, where Israel sacrifices a lamb and marks the blood on their doors and is told to eat your meal in haste. Don't wait for your bread to rise. Use unleavened bread and eat in haste with your sandals on, your bags packed, your staff in hand, because tonight is the Passover of the Lord. We see it in the manna in the wilderness, when God feeds Israel miraculously from heaven with manna, which in Hebrew, manna, it's like, what's that? I don't know what this stuff is. Tastes good, though, apparently. It tastes like wafers with honey. My son, who really loves, we say he's a confectionarian because he just eats sweets. He thinks this sounds like pretty good food, like honey crackers. He's like, yeah, let's go. Manna from heaven. We see it in Leviticus with all of the different sacrifices. In fact, my daughter once, when we were reading through Leviticus with her when she was 10, as you do with your 10-year-old, right? I mean, why not read Leviticus? She was also learning to bake simultaneously. And as we're reading through some of the ways that the sacrifices are laid out, she gets really excited. She's like, Mom, God's giving them recipes. And she was totally right. So all the sacrifices in Leviticus are about food, and we'll talk more about that in a minute. We see it in the New Testament as well. Jesus feeds the 5,000 with the loaves and fishes in the wilderness. We see it in a really creepy way in John 6 when Jesus says, if you do not eat of my flesh and drink of my blood, you have no part of me. And lots of people leave because that sounds really weird. And it does. We see it in the Last Supper, the passage from Mark that Pastor Taylor read for us. When Jesus is eating with his friends, and he takes the bread and he breaks it, and he says, take, eat, this is my body. And then he takes the cup and he says, take, drink, this is my blood of the new covenant that is shed for you. We see it in Emmaus, when Jesus, in disguise, sits down with some of these friends who are mourning his death, and he takes the bread, and as he breaks it for them, they realize, oh my gosh, this is Jesus. And then he disappears. We see it on the beach at the end of John, when Jesus barbecues up some fish for his disciples. and has a particularly pointed conversation with Peter, because Peter was not the best of friends a few days earlier. Peter had denied even knowing Jesus. And so they've got to talk it out. And they eat together, fish and bread. We see it in Acts 2 as the believers eat together in homes. We see it in the communion celebrations that are apparently happening and going completely awry, as we will see in Corinthians. And we even see it in the eschatological feast in Revelation, when somehow that last scene of the play, there's going to be a feast of some sort. The prophets talk about it in Joel and Jeremiah and Isaiah. There's this idea that there's going to be new wine and a feast of the best meats and the finest wines. So you see, food is actually the key to the whole Bible. And we see through all of these meals that there's a really important sort of thing that emerges. There are the people who get to eat with God and the people who don't eat with God. There are the people whose table in the college dining hall is Jesus' table, and they know that's where they belong, and they can sit down there and eat. And there are the people who aren't at that table. In every single one of these stories, people are eating with God or not eating with God. Now, Israel knew as a people group how to eat with God. First of all, they had the Passover. And the Passover is something that many of you probably saw the movie Prince of Egypt once upon a time. Yeah? Okay, good. So you know then that God had been performing all of these plagues to show his power, because in Egypt believed that Pharaoh was their god. And so you have this sort of showdown of the gods going on in Exodus. And the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, the God of Israel, is going to show his power over the other gods, specifically the god of Egypt, because Egypt is the biggest, baddest empire around at that stage. And that empire has enslaved God's people. So we have this battle of the gods that goes on, and it gets worse and worse. It starts out the river turns to blood, and that's nice enough. And then there's the frogs that come, and they're like even in the bread bowls and in their beds. I mean, I love frogs, they're really cute, but I do not want frogs in my bread bowl or in my bed. Like, can you imagine, like, kind of cold and slimy when you get into bed at night and there's a frog that hops out? And then there are the gnats. But the word gnat, actually, I was reading up on, Robert Alter points out that really the word for it's probably more like either mosquitoes or lice. So gnats are bad, but imagine a plague of mosquitoes that you cannot get away from them, and they're just biting you everywhere. Sorry, I shouldn't pull that so close to my mouth. How many of you are itching just thinking about a plague of mosquitoes? Or a plague of lice? Like all through everything. So it's getting worse. And then there's the hailstorm from heaven where everything is destroyed. Massive, massive thunder and lightning. Darkness, utter and complete darkness. Some of you have been in utter and complete darkness. It's really scary, actually. I once was doing something very, very stupid that I do not recommend to anyone in this room. I was walking down a railroad track through a tunnel, but the tunnel bent, so you get to this part where you cannot see either the exit to the tunnel or the entrance to the tunnel. And I say it was really stupid because it was an active railroad track. Don't do this. But I did learn something really important in that moment, besides that you should never walk on a railroad track like this. And that was, once you kind of cross that bend and you are in utter darkness, it only takes about 10, 15 seconds before your brain starts to play crazy tricks on you. It felt like the entire physical world around me had disappeared, and the only thing that was left was the tie that was under my foot. And I started to seriously doubt that the next tie was actually going to be there. I kind of would step kind of gingerly, but as quickly as I could, because I wanted to get back around the bend before a train came. Imagine a plague of days of utter darkness. It says nobody moved from their spot. I don't blame them, I wouldn't have either. And then you get all the questions like, what happens when you had to go to the bathroom? Like, when your kid gets hungry. This would not be very fun. But Pharaoh still would not let the people go. And so God says, I'm going to send my last plague. the firstborn of every house of Egypt will die. The angel of death is going to pass through Egypt, and the firstborn will die. But you, Israel, you will take a lamb, and you will slaughter it at twilight. And everyone will take the blood of the lamb and paint it on the doorframe. And all who are in the house will be safe. And you will cook up the lamb, and you'll eat it. And you'll eat it with unleavened bread. It's really important not to take the yeast from Egypt with them, because yeast is a living thing. Yeast takes on the characteristics of the world that it is in, and this is why breads baked in certain places have certain flavors that you cannot reproduce in other kitchens. This is why the kitchen of a baker, the bread will rise better than in the kitchen of someone who's never baked before, because the very atmosphere is changed by the presence of yeast, and yeast is changed by the presence of the atmosphere around it. And God says, no yeast will come with you from Egypt. You have to get rid of all of it. We're going to eat unleavened bread because this is a meal in haste, and we don't want to take any of the life of Egypt with us. And so they eat, ready to go. They eat the bread. They drink the wine. They eat the lamb. And the angel of death passes over Egypt, and all are freed, who are in the houses. And all are dead. Well, the firstborns. I'm a firstborn, so to me that's, all of them. All the firstborns are dead who are in Egypt. And then Israel gets to leave, and they go out into the desert, and God gives them instructions on how to eat with him in the future. He gives them instructions for the Passover that they will keep every single year as a festival meal to the Lord, where they will eat together and remember that they were slaves in Egypt, but now they're not slaves in Egypt. Why? Because God has freed them from slavery. And this Passover becomes the paradigmatic, that means the ultimate form of salvation and redemption for the entire rest of the Bible. I know we always think the cross is like the paradigmatic salvation event. It's not. It's actually the Exodus, and it's the Exodus that Paul uses to understand what the cross is about. It's the Exodus that the early church looks at and says, this is what the cross was about. If we don't understand the Exodus and the importance of food and eating and what it is to be part of that community that is eating together in the darkness, we do not understand the cross. So we've got to get our imaginations back around that. But they're also going to eat with God at other times, because you see, the altar in the ancient world was where people ate with the gods. It was like God's dinner table. Now, they knew that God wasn't actually eating the meat, but the idea was that the smell, the aroma of the meat pleased the gods, and so you really do not want hangry gods. I mean, someday I want somebody to write like a parody, Sinners in the Hands of a Hangry God, right? Because when your gods are hungry, they get angry, and angry gods and hungry gods do not do nice things to their people. So it's really important that you're always preparing sacrifices for your gods so that they can eat. One of the sacrifices was called the going up or the burnt offering, and this offering was to allow people to enter into the presence of God. There were 5 types of offerings, so the going up offering is one. The second one is what's called the first fruits or the Thanksgiving offering. And this is when you go and you give the first of your agricultural production to God, you sacrifice it there, and the leftovers actually go to the priests to help support the priesthood, because they need to eat, and their job is butchering all the sacrifices all the time. Priests in the Bible are basically ancient butchers. I mean, no, literally they are, right? They're the ones butchering the animals and slicing them up and putting the different cuts where they go accordingly, be it for God, for themselves, or for the people who brought the sacrifices, because the people who bring the sacrifices also get to eat them. There's the peace offering, and we call it the peace offering, but really it's like a fellowship offering. The root of the word in Hebrew is the same root of shalom. It's a flourishing offering. And this one you brought just because you wanted to, because you wanted to eat with God and all of your friends. It is the backyard barbecue to beat all backyard barbecues, because instead of being in my decent backyard, it's in God's backyard. And you barbecue up the meat on the altar, you gather all your friends around, you bake bread, you include a wine offering in this one, and the priests eat with you and drink with you, and all your friends eat and drink with you. It's a time of great flourishing and fellowship. Then there's the purification offering. And this is not, it's sometimes called the sin offering, and that's actually a really poor translation, because anything can make you impure, not anything, a whole lot of things, though, can make you impure, ritually speaking, in the ancient world. So childbirth makes you ritually impure. Menstruation makes you ritually impure. Touching a dead body or being in contact with something dead makes you ritually impure. There are all sorts of things that can make you ritually impure. And so you needed to have a way to restore purity, and so that's what these offerings were for. And then the last one is the guilt offering. And this is where, I know I did something wrong. And I need to, make up for it. Now, that can all feel ancient, and oftentimes we think, wow, that's an interesting point of history, but why in the world have you just wasted my time telling me about these 5 offerings? Because as much as we don't do them in the same way, they are very much a part of our real world. Think about this for a second. First fruits, Thanksgiving offering. How many of you are going to be doing something for Thanksgiving? I want to see some hands, come on. Oh, there we go, Thanksgiving offering, right? This offering where we recognize what we have comes from God. I'm not going to ask you to raise your hand whether you put anything in the tithe plate or not. But that's another form of a Thanksgiving offering, a way that we say what we have is from God, and we're offering the first of our fruits, the first of our labors back to God. How many of you like to have friends around to just celebrate good stuff? Birthdays, just because I found a really great price on a really good leg of lamb. Anyone like parties? Yeah, I like parties. The fellowship offering or the peace offering, it's the same idea. We eat together to celebrate all the time. And we want God to be there too, as Christian people. Any of you ever felt the need to detox in your food? Sometimes after Thanksgiving, I think I'm gonna eat salads for a week. Those meals we make because we know we need to detox a little in whatever way that means. Purification offerings. And finally, guilt offerings. I'm sure no one here has ever made a very nice dinner for a partner or another loved one because you know you messed up and you need to say sorry and you need to talk it out. And the best thing to do is to make their favorite dinner and get them at the table with you so that you can maybe sort things out. These offerings are very much part of our real lives. We just have forgotten that for Israel, you would only eat meat in the ancient world if it had been sacrificed to a god, because meat is too costly a thing. You would always offer it first. And we forget that what they were doing was eating with God. Which makes a lot of sense, too, because if they're eating with God and they're cooking for God, well, Israel's also just described metaphorically in the Bible as being God's wife, right? God is the husband to Israel. So, I mean, it makes total sense that Israel's cooking for God every day, right? It's just part of the metaphor. And they know how to do it. They know how God likes his lamb. No sugar glazes, by the way. He's very clear about this, just in case you're wondering. No, seriously, in the Levitical laws, he's like, don't put any sugar on it. I find it really amusing that is included in there. Israel are a people who get to eat with God. They know how to eat with God. They know how to behave at a party with God. They know what it looks like. They know they're supposed to share their abundance with other people. They know the priests get their cut. They know that when you do a peace offering, you welcome everyone in and celebrate together, because the table of God is to be a place where there is justice and flourishing, and where we remember that we were slaves in Egypt, and now we are free, and now we're together, and we get to eat with God. And then a whole bunch of ex-pagans start getting interested in this thing after Jesus. And why do I call them ex-pagans? Well, because in the ancient world, if you were Jewish, there were 2 types of people in the world. There were the people of God, Israel, and there were the pagans. There were the people who ate with God, and there were the pagans. And when Jesus comes, he's Jewish. His whole family's Jewish. His mom's Jewish, his dad's Jewish, his aunt's Jewish, his uncle's Jewish, his brothers and sisters, cousins, everybody's Jewish. His disciples are Jewish. And Jesus says, go and tell everyone, right? The Great Commission. Go and preach the gospel to all nations, teaching them to obey all that I have commanded you in the name of the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, right? Great Commission. It's on your wall out there. Well, and they do what they're told. Except now all of these pagans don't want to be pagans anymore. They want to start coming along, so they're ex-pagans. The problem is they still think like pagans and act like pagans, because that's all they've ever known. I mean, they grew up going to altars for Zeus and Bona Dea and Bacchus. Y'all know who Bacchus is? Oh yeah? Oh good, yeah. He's the Roman god of wine and debauchery. So they like, yeah, I totally know how to eat at a table of a god. Yeah, I do it all the time. Like, Zeus last week, Bacchus next week. My wife goes to Bona Dea. She was a goddess that was exclusive to women in the Roman Empire. And they're like, but I really like this Jesus guy. I really want to be part of this, the God of Israel. This sounds really good. But they're still thinking and acting like pagans. And they are making a mess of things. In fact, they're making such a mess in Corinth that Paul has to write a letter to them. Paul has an interesting relationship with the Corinthians. Some scholars have suggested that the thorn in Paul's flesh that he mentions in one of his letters to the Corinthians is actually the Corinthian church. I quite like that reading, and it fits with Paul's snarkiness. One of the things I did not appreciate growing up was just how snarky Paul really is. He loves to imagine interlocutors like conversation partners, and he loves to like mock back at the congregations things they have said to him. And you'll hear that in this passage. So we're going to turn our attention for just a moment to 1 Corinthians 10, verses 18 to 33, and then 11, 17 to 29. So, Corinthians 10:18. Actually, sorry, Corinthians 10:14. I wrote down the wrong starting verse. Therefore, my dear friends, flee from idolatry. I speak to sensible people. Judge for yourselves what I say. Is not the cup of thanksgiving for which we give thanks a participation in the blood of Christ? And is not the bread that we break a participation in the body of Christ? Because there is one loaf, we who are many are one body, for we partake of one loaf. Consider the people of Israel. Do those who eat the sacrifices participate in the altar? Do I mean that the food sacrificed to an idol is anything, or that the idol is anything? No. But the sacrifices of pagans are offered to demons, not to God. And I do not want you to be participants with demons. You cannot drink the cup of the Lord and the cup of demons too. You can't have a part in both the Lord's table and the table of demons. Are we trying to arouse the Lord's jealousy? Are we stronger than he? I've been watching a lot of quintessential high school, college-y sort of movies with my daughter recently. Things like, Legally Blonde, 10 Things I Hate About You. Those that are all Mean Girls, those movies that are about kind of the social dynamics of girls coming of age. And you know how if you sit with a certain group of people in the lunchroom, that means you're part of their team, right? You're part of their clique. And if you sit with them, you absolutely cannot sit with these people over here. You know these sorts of dynamics? We see that they thrive in middle school and high schools and colleges and real life. And this is what Paul is saying. Look, if you eat with the gods over there, you can't come and eat with our God over here. That's just not how this works. Why? Because God is a jealous God. Ooh, that doesn't sound very nice. That's what Paul says. We'll turn back to that in a second. Of course, now he's going to mock the Corinthians because they are saying things like, well, but I have the right to do anything, you say. Yeah, but not everything's beneficial. I have the right to do anything, but not everything is constructive. No one should seek their own good, but the good of others. Eat anything sold in the market without raising questions of conscience. For sure, the earth is the Lord and everything's in it. But if an unbeliever invites you to a meal and you want to go, eat whatever is put before you without raising questions of conscience. But if someone says to you, this has been offered in sacrifice, then do not eat it, both for the sake of the one who told you and for the sake of conscience. I'm referring to other people's conscience, not your own. I kind of wonder if he's being sarcastic there. In fact, I think he is. I wonder if you have a conscience, dear Corinthians. For why is my freedom being judged through another's conscience? If I take part in the meal with thankfulness, why am I denounced because of something that I thank God for? Fine. Whatever you do, whatever you eat, whatever you drink, do it all for the glory of God. Do not cause anyone to stumble, whether Jews or Greeks or the church of God. God is a jealous God. He doesn't want us eating with other gods. And the Corinthians don't get this. They think it's totally fine. I can eat wherever I want. But you see, they're making a mess of things here doesn't stop right there. It's not just that they're hanging out with Zeus in the morning and coming to hang out with Jesus in the afternoon. It's actually affecting the way they treat each other at the table too, when they eat together. If we flip over to chapter 11, Paul starts in verse 17, "In the following directives, I have no praise for you. Your meetings do more harm than good. In the first place, I hear that when you come together as a church, there are divisions among you. And to some extent, I believe it. No doubt, there have to be differences among you to show which of you have God's approval. So then, when you come together, it is not the Lord's supper you eat. For when you are eating, some of you go ahead with your own private suppers, and as a result, one person remains hungry and another gets drunk. Don't you have your own homes to eat and drink in? Or do you despise the church of God by humiliating those who have nothing? What shall I say to you? Shall I praise you? Certainly not. For I received from the Lord what I've also passed on to you. The Lord Jesus, on the night he was betrayed, took bread, and when he had given thanks, he broke it, and he said, 'This is my body, which is for you. Do this in remembrance of me.' In the same way, after supper, he took the cup, saying, 'This is the new covenant in my blood. Do this whenever you drink it in remembrance of me. For whenever you eat this bread and drink this cup, you proclaim the death of the Lord until he comes.'" You're supposed to be eating this as a festival meal together with God and to God. But you're using it as a way to show off, I've got the fancy lunch and you don't have anything because I'm better than you. Clearly, God has blessed me. That makes me better than you. It's mean girls in the Church of Corinth. The Corinthians didn't know how to eat with God. They wanted to be at the table with Jesus, but they were making a hot mess of it. Now, I want to be really clear here. Paul is not saying, and nor am I saying, that ex-pagans are not welcome at the table of God. Nor is he saying that you have to be perfect to eat with Jesus. Anyone who wanted to be at the table with Jesus got to be at the table with Jesus. He didn't turn people away because of their pasts. He didn't turn people away because of the line of work they were in, even when that line of work was prostitution. He didn't turn people away because they were complicit with the Roman occupation that was abusing the people of God, that was abusing Israel. He didn't turn tax collectors away. Anyone who wanted to be with Jesus got to be with Jesus. So this is not a table for the perfect. But God is a jealous God. It's actually just the negative way of saying something we say all the time. Love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your strength, and with all your mind. For this is the first and great commandment. What is it to love God with all of your heart, but to be exclusive to God? What is it to love God with all your soul, but to be exclusive to God? It's just the positive of the negative, right? God is jealous. Love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength. But what's really interesting is that's actually the second half of the verse. The first half in Deuteronomy is, remember, for I am the Lord your God who brought you out of Egypt. Therefore you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength. Why should we be exclusively devoted to God and not be hanging out with Zeus or Bacchus before we come to the table of Jesus? Because God is the one who has freed us. Because God is the one who has rescued us from slavery. Because Jesus is the one who has rescued us from the slavery of sin and death. And so, friends, we get to be the people who are at the table with Jesus. It is a Passover meal. It is a meal that we consume in the darkness, that we eat in haste, because we are still waiting for the ultimate salvation to come. It's not here yet. Many of you know this all too well. Broken families, addiction, mental health issues, diagnoses that are just too awful, jobs that suck, bosses who are making your life a misery, teachers who are making your life a misery, difficulties with your partners. This world is broken, and we all experience this in a deep, deep way. This is a Passover table, a table in which we huddle together, safe inside, the blood marked on the door, but we eat in haste, knowing that the redemption of the Lord is coming, even though it's not here yet. But it's also a festival table. It's a foretaste of all that new wine and meat and the great, great meal that we get to eat together eventually. But here's the thing, this is not a feast, let's be honest. It's a really mediocre cracker and a little bit of grape juice. So I think it's better to think of it not as a feast, but as a foretaste. Many of us might have very lovely childhood memories of a barbecue, when maybe our dad or our Theo or someone was barbecuing up a beautiful tri-tip or a leg of lamb. Anyone remember that? And you can smell it on the barbecue, and you're like, oh, it's coming. But you know how those family meals are always late getting started, right? Like we were supposed to have lunch at like 1 p.m., and now it's 2 p.m., and now it's 3 p.m., and your uncle still hasn't shown up, and you know the meat's taking longer to cook than everyone imagined, and for some reason the potatoes aren't quite right. Or is this just my family's experience? Oh, good, okay, glad we're not the only ones that struggle with this. And I remember as a kid, my dad would bring the tri-tip off the barbecue, and he'd cover it with aluminum foil like you do to let it rest. And if you've not had my dad's tri-tip, it is excellent. And my brother and I would be like, we're so hungry, Dad, we can't wait. Oh my gosh, is it ever gonna be time for dinner? And you know that little end of the tri-tip that's got like that perfect mixture of like fat and meat and all the really good seasonings kind of concentrated on it? That little bite, I'm seeing nods, yes, we all know that little bite. He would slice that little bit off for us, and he'd hand it to us, like, here's a little bite to tide you over. Oh, so good. So, so good. That is what this meal is. This meal is Jesus saying to you, I know you are hungry. I know your stomach is growling. I know you want the feast to come. Here's a little bite to tide you over. Here's a little bite to sustain you until that day when the Lord says, on this mountain, I will prepare a feast for all people, a feast of the finest wines and the best of meats. It's Isaiah chapter 25. And this is our foretaste. This is our little end of the tri-tip. Saying, here, come and have breakfast. As Jesus said to Peter on the beach, take and eat. And as part of how we have remembered this meal for 2,000 years, the people of God have read the words in 1 Corinthians that Paul tells the Corinthians to remind them who they are and what it is they are eating. So I'm going to invite Taylor to come up and offer those words for us over this meal.